The rain never stops here. That's what everyone says about the Olympic Peninsula, but that's not quite true. There are exactly 27 days a year on average when no rain falls. I know because I've counted them, logged them, and tracked them meticulously for the past 11 years. My name is Matt Winters, and I work at the Crawford Ridge Weather Station, nestled in the densely forested foothills of the Olympic Mountains. We're one of the oldest, continuously operated weather stations in Washington state, established in 1952 to monitor the unique weather patterns created by the convergence of maritime influence and mountain topography. Our station is pretty remote. The nearest town is Forks, about 30 miles southwest of us. The only way to reach us is via a winding gravel road that becomes impassable during the worst winter storms. Cell service is pretty much non-existent. Internet connection is spotty at best. Our primary communication with the outside world is a satellite phone and a radio system. Most weather stations these days are automated. They're human operators replaced by sophisticated equipment that can function without sleep, complaints, or paychecks. But Crawford Ridge remains staffed year-round. The official reason is that our location requires regular maintenance due to the extreme conditions. Unofficial rumors suggest that our station collects data beyond standard weather measurements, atmospheric research too sensitive to trust automation. The truth I've come to believe is something else entirely. When I arrived in 2014, fresh from my meteorology program at the University of Washington, I was greeted by the station chief. She was a woman in her early 60s, and her face was weathered from decades of wind and rain. Her eyes sharp and assessing as she looked me over. "So you're the replacement," she said without preamble. "Yeah, the guy before you left rather suddenly." She didn't elaborate on why, and something in her expression discouraged me from asking. The station operated with a permanent staff of 4. The chief, 2 meteorologists, and a maintenance technician. After showing me to my quarters, a small but comfortable room in the residential wing of the main building, Chief handed me a laminated card. "These are the station rules. They may seem odd to you, but they need to be followed. Breaking them is grounds for immediate termination." I took the card expecting some standard safety protocols, but instead I read, "Rule 1. Never go outside alone between 3 a.m. and 3:47 a.m., regardless of weather conditions or circumstances. Rule 2. The equipment in the corner of the main monitoring room must be cleaned only by Chief. Do not touch it, even if it appears malfunctioning. Rule 3. If you hear whistling from the forest while on exterior duty, return to the station immediately. Document the date, time, and direction in the red logbook kept in the supply closet. Rule 4. All animal carcasses found on station grounds must be reported immediately. Do not touch them, do not photograph them. Rule 5. If the phone rings exactly twice, stops, and then rings again, do not answer it. Disconnect the line for exactly 30 minutes and then reconnect it. Rule 6. If the northern perimeter sensors trigger between midnight and 6 a.m., do not check the cameras. Reset the system at 6:01 a.m. precisely. I looked up at Chief Ellis, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I asked, "Wait, are these serious?" "Deadly," she replied, her expression unchanged. "Do you have a problem with them?" "No, but I don't understand what they're meant for." "You don't have to worry about that for now," she said, turning to leave. At the door, she paused, though. "A word of advice. Don't ask the others about them, especially the other meteorologist, Reed. He was here when we made them." My first 3 months at Crawford Ridge passed by without incident. The work was fascinating. The Olympic Peninsula creates some of the most complex microclimates in North America, and my colleagues were competent if somewhat reserved. Chief Ellis ran the station with military precision. The other meteorologist, Reed, was brilliant but reclusive. And Kate, the service technician, was friendly enough during working hours but retreated to her quarters after her shift had ended. None of them ever mentioned anything about the rules. They followed them as naturally as breathing, and I quickly fell into the same patterns. I avoided going outside during the strange 47-minute window before dawn. I steered clear of the chief's equipment in the corner. I found myself adapting to the rhythm of Crawford Ridge without questioning any of its oddities. Until November 17th, when the first major storm of the season had hit. It began around midnight, wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour, rainfall measuring nearly 2 inches per hour. Typical peninsula weather amplified by the mountain topography. I was on night shift with Reed, monitoring the storm's progression, when the power flickered. The generator should kick in," Reed said without looking up from his console. The light stabilized for a moment and then went out completely. The emergency lighting cast the monitoring room in an eerie red glow. "Well, that's not right," Reed muttered, reaching for the radio. "Hey, Kate, do you copy? We've lost main power in the backup generator." Static answered him. She's probably already on her way to the generator building," I offered. Reed checked his watch. 2:53 a.m. His expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Nah, she knows better than to do that at this time." He tried the radio again, but nothing. "I'm going to check the generator," I said, reaching for my rain gear. Reed caught my arm. "Hey, wait until 3:48. It's not worth the risk." "But the equipment." "It can handle 47 minutes without power," he finished firmly. We wait. But something in his voice betrayed a deeper concern than just the equipment being damaged. I remembered the chief mentioning that Reed had been present when the rules were created. "What happens at 3 a.m.? I asked directly. His jaw tightened. "Nothing, if you're inside where you belong." At 3:05, the radio crackled to life. "Help, outside the... can't find." Kate's voice broke through in fragments before dissolving into static. Reed's face went pale. "She's outside during blackout hours. Well, we have to help her," I insisted, already putting on my jacket. Rule 1 exists for a reason, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. Kate was his colleague, possibly his friend. "You follow the rules," I said. "I haven't been here long enough to know any better, right?" Before he could stop me, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the exit. The storm hit me like a physical wall as I stepped outside. Rain driving horizontally, wind threatening to knock me off my feet. Lightning illuminated the station grounds in brief, disorienting flashes. "Kate," I called, my voice lost in the howling wind. The generator building was about 50 yards from the main station, a small concrete structure housing our backup power system. I aimed my flashlight toward it and began making my way across the compound, fighting against the storm with each step. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, I saw something that made me freeze. A figure was standing in the tree line, partially obscured by the driving rain. It was tall and impossibly thin, and it stood perfectly still despite the raging wind. I raised my flashlight, but the beam wouldn't reach that far. "Kate?" I called, though I knew immediately that it wasn't her. The proportions were way off. The limbs were too long and the head was too small. Lightning flashed again. The figure was closer now, though I hadn't seen it move. It stood at the edge of the compound, no more than 30 yards away. The flashlight beam finally caught it, revealing nothing. Just empty air where I had been certain that I had seen someone standing. The wind changed direction and I caught a sound beneath its howling, a soft and rhythmic whistling. Rule 3 flashed into my mind. I hesitated. I had to make up my mind. I turned to go back, but in the darkness and driving rain, I had become disoriented. The station's lights were out, leaving me with no reference point. I spun slowly, searching for any landmark that I could find. Lightning struck again, much closer this time. In its stark illumination, I saw the generator building about 20 yards to my right, and standing in its open doorway was Kate, her expression frozen in terror, her mouth open in what must have been a scream that I couldn't hear over the storm. I ran over toward her, relief flooding through me. "Kate, are you okay?" She didn't respond. As I drew closer, I realized that she wasn't moving at all. She stood rigidly in the doorway staring past me, her body trembling slightly. "Kate!" I reached for her shoulder. The moment that I touched her, she collapsed, her body suddenly boneless. I caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently. Her skin was ice cold and her eyes open but unfocused. "Hey, what happened? Talk to me." Her lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear. I leaned closer. "It walks at dawn. It collects. It remembers." A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran through me. "Hey, we need to get inside. Can you walk?" She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. Slowly, I turned to follow her gaze. The figure that I had seen at the tree line outstood less than 10 feet away. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, I could see it clearly. It had the shape of a human, but everything about it was off. Its limbs were too jointed, had too many fingers, its head cocked at an impossible angle. It wore what looked like standard rain gear similar to mine, but the material clung to a frame that just didn't look right. In the darkness that followed the lightning, I heard it whistle. 3 perfect notes in a sequence that made my teeth ache. I lifted Kate, who was actually surprisingly light, and began running toward where I thought the main station should be. The wind pushed against us, rain blinded me, but terror drove me forward. Behind us, the whistling continued, changing pitch and tempo but never stopping. I don't know how I found the station. Maybe I was lucky, or perhaps some unconscious awareness of the compound's layout. The door opened before I reached it. Reed was standing there, a rifle in his hands. "Inside," he said, his eyes fixed on something behind me. "Now." I carried Kate through the door, which Reed slammed shut and locked behind us. The sudden silence was as disorienting as the storm had been. "What was that?" I gasped, lowering Kate onto a couch in the break room. Reed ignored my question, kneeling beside Kate. "What did you see?" Her eyes found his, recognition slowly returning. "It was just standing there watching the station. When the power went out, I thought that someone might have been hurt." "So you went outside?" Reed said. It wasn't a question. "After midnight in a storm." I checked my watch. It was 2:48. I had time. "Your watch stopped," Reed said, lifting her wrist to show us. The timepiece was still frozen at 2:48, the same way that Frank's did. "Who's Frank?" "The guy that worked here before you. He disappeared. You're his replacement." Reed helped Kate to a sitting position. "We call it the Dawn Walker. It appears in the forest around the station always between 3 and 3:47 a.m., always whistling. We don't know what it is and we don't know what it wants. Is it a person, an animal?" Frank thought that it was a person, Reed said grimly. He tried to communicate with it last year, stepped right out the door at 3:15, walked toward it with his hands raised in greeting. What happened to him? I asked, though part of me already knew. We found his clothes the next morning, laid out in the middle of the compound as if he were still wearing them. Empty. His watch had stopped at 3:15. Reed looked at Kate. Hey, you're lucky you only saw it. Frank tried to make contact. The power came back on at 3:48 exactly, the lights and equipment humming to life as if nothing had happened. And Kate recovered physically but requested a transfer the following week. Her replacement arrived in December, a quiet, efficient woman who always went by the book. I began to understand why. After the incident with the Dawnwalker, I developed a healthy respect for the station rules. I followed them, not out of blind obedience, but from the primal fear that comes with confronting something beyond your understanding. My colleagues noticed the change in my attitude. Reed became marginally more approachable, and Chief Ellis actually nodded approvingly when she caught me documenting a whistling incident in the red logbook. But Rule 2 continued to puzzle me. The equipment in question was unlike anything else at the station. It wasn't easy to categorize into the typical types of machinery that we would use for tracking the weather. It was its own altogether. It resembled a modified seismograph with multiple recording drums and styluses, but it also incorporated what looked like audio equipment, microphones, filters, and amplifiers. A series of glass tubes containing different colored liquids connected various components. The entire thing was linked to a dedicated computer system that ran software that I didn't recognize. Chief maintained it with religious devotion. Every morning at precisely 7 a.m., she would clean every component, check the fluid levels in the glass tubes, and review the previous day's recordings. Nobody else was permitted to approach it, not even when the chief was away from the station on her rare trips to Seattle for administrative meetings. During one such absence in my second year at the job, the machine began to behave strangely. It started with a low pulsing hum that gradually increased in volume over several hours. Reed and I traded concerned glances as the sound became impossible to ignore. Should we call her? I asked, gesturing to the phone. Reed shook his head. She's in meetings with the regional director all day. Rule 2 is explicit. We don't touch it, even if it's malfunctioning. By noon, the machine was vibrating visibly. The styluses were bouncing erratically against the recording drums. One of the tubes had begun to bubble, its green liquid turning slowly to a murky brown. I don't know, this isn't normal. What if it explodes or something? It won't, Reed said, though he kept glancing at it nervously. It's done this before. What is it even measuring? I asked, not for the first time. Reed hesitated and then sighed. The chief calls it a phenomenon barometer. It doesn't measure weather in the conventional sense. It measures patterns, aberrations, things that shouldn't happen but do. Well, that's not very scientific, I pointed out. Neither is a figure that appears only during a specific time window and leaves empty clothes behind, he countered. The humming suddenly changed pitch, becoming a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. The computer connected to the machine began cycling through screens of data too quickly to read. Call Ellis, Reed decided, reaching for the phone. Before he could dial, though, the power went out, just as it had on the night of the storm. This time, however, though, it was a clear and calm day. No weather event could explain the outage. The emergency lights came on, bathing the room in that same eerie red glow. In the light, Ellis's machine looked almost alive. its components continuing to function despite the power loss. The styluses scratched frantically across the drums, the glass tubes bubbled and changed colors, and the computer screens flickered with images that I couldn't quite make out. "That's impossible," I whispered. "It shouldn't be running without power." Reed backed away from the machine, pulling me with him. "We need to leave the monitoring room, now." "Why? What's it doing?" "It's not measuring anymore. It's predicting." As if in response to his words, one of the glass tubes shattered, spraying dark liquid across the wall. The liquid began to move, flowing upward against gravity, forming shapes that resembled letters. "Don't look at it," Reed warned, turning away. "Don't try to read it." But I couldn't help myself. The shapes were becoming more defined, forming recognizable words. "She is not Ellis." The humming stopped abruptly. The liquid on the wall began to drip normally again, the message dissolving into meaningless streaks. The machine powered down, and a moment later, the regular lights came back on. Reed and I stood in silence, staring at the now inactive equipment. "What did that mean?" I finally asked. "She is not Ellis." Reed shook his head. "We don't discuss what the machine does." "But..." "No," he cut me off sharply. "Some rules exist because breaking them will get you fired. Some exist because breaking them will get you killed." Chief Ellis returned the following day. If she noticed the faint stains on the wall or the replaced glass tube, which Reed had carefully substituted from our supply room, she didn't mention it. She performed her usual maintenance routine, and then spent several hours reviewing the machine's recordings in private. That evening, she called me into her office. "I've heard you have questions about the equipment," she stated as I took a seat across from her desk. "Well, yes," I admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "Why did you come to Crawford Ridge in the first place?" The question caught me off guard. "Because it's one of the few staffed weather stations left. Because the conditions here are so unique. Is that all?" I hesitated and then decided on honesty. I was interested in the rumors about atmospheric research. A slight smile tugged at her lips. "Atmospheric research. That's a convenient euphemism." She leaned forward. "The machine monitors boundary conditions." "Boundary conditions of what?" "Of reality," she said simply. "This region exists at a convergence point, not just of weather systems but of other less tangible patterns. The machine helps maintain the distinction between what should happen and what shouldn't." I struggled to make sense of her words. "Like the Dawnwalker." "The Dawnwalker is a symptom, not the condition," Alice replied. "There are places in this world where causality becomes permeable, where intention can reshape outcome. The Olympic Peninsula contains several such points. Crawford Ridge monitors one of them. Well, that doesn't explain why only you can maintain the equipment." Alice's expression hardened. "The machine requires a primary operator, someone bonded to its functioning. I've been that operator for 29 years. When I retire, somebody else would take over that responsibility." Her eyes met mine meaningfully. "Someone is being evaluated for the position." The conversation left me with more questions than answers, but I never approached Alice's machine again. I would catch her watching me sometimes, particularly when the weather got bad, assessing me, evaluating whether I could be trusted with whatever responsibility she carried. 3 months after our conversation, Alice's machine activated during another power outage. This time, though, the liquid that had spread across the wall formed into different words. She has always been Ellis. I never told anyone what I saw. Some rules exist for reasons beyond understanding. And rule number 2 had already shown me more than I wanted to know. Rule number 3 seemed straightforward after my encounter during the storm. If you hear whistling from the forest while on exterior duty, return to the station immediately. Document the date, time, and direction in the red logbook kept in the supply closet. Now the whistling wasn't common. I heard it perhaps once every few months, and it was always distant and always brief. Each time I followed the rules, an immediate return to the station, and careful documentation in the mysterious red logbook. No one ever reviewed these entries as far as I could tell. The logbook contained records dating back all the way to the 70s. Hundreds of whistling incidents documented in different handwritings. Sometimes there were gaps of years between entries. Other times, multiple incidents were recorded in a single week. During my 3rd year, the pattern changed up though. It began in late September, whistling incidents occurring with increasing frequency, first weekly and then almost daily, always from the eastern forest and always at different times of the day. The sound remained distant, but the tone shifted, becoming more complex, almost melodic. It's unusual, Reed acknowledged when I pointed out the pattern, but not unprecedented. There was a similar cluster back in 1987. What happened then? I'll check the personnel records if you're curious, he suggested, which was more information than he typically offered. The station maintained physical employment records in the admin office. With Ellis's permission, I accessed the files from 1987. Crawford Ridge had operated with a staff of 6 that year, larger than what we currently had. By December 1987, that number had dropped down to 3. No explanations were provided for the departures, just cryptic notations. Contract terminated or voluntary separation. Names and dates meant nothing to me until I noticed a pattern in the red logbook. The whistling incidents in '87 had been documented primarily by somebody named Lawrence Ketchen. His entries grew increasingly detailed as the year progressed, describing not just time and direction but the specific notes and patterns of the whistling. His final entry dated November 30th, 1987 read, "Whistling from Eastern Forest, 1423. Pattern appears to be responding to my movements. Testing this hypothesis tomorrow." There was no entry on December 1st. Ketchen's employment record showed his contract was terminated that day. I brought this information to Reed, who had been at the station since 1985. Yeah, Ketchens thought he could communicate with it. He had been documenting the whistling for months, convinced it was a form of language. Was he right? Reed's expression darkened. On December 1st, he went into the forest alone. We heard whistling for nearly an hour, much longer than any previous incident. When he didn't return by nightfall, we organized a search party. "Did you find him?" "Oh, parts of him," Reed said quietly. "Scattered along a perfect east-west line, exactly 100 yards apart. His vocal cords were missing." The whistling continued daily through October and into November of my 3rd year, and I documented each incident. Whatever produced that sound was not trying to talk to us. It was calling out to us, luring us. On November 29th, I was performing routine maintenance on the external temperature sensors when the whistling began again. This time it was different though, louder, closer, and unmistakably mimicking the pattern of my own movements. I took 3 steps forward. The whistling produced 3 distinct notes. I moved to my right and the sound shifted to match. It was tracking to me, responding to me. Following Rule 3, I immediately headed back toward the station. The whistling intensified, changing from mimicry to something that raised the hair on my neck. A sound like my name formed without words, carried on the wind. I broke into a run. Behind me, branches cracked as something moved through the forest. The whistling transformed into a kind of laughter. High musical notes that overlapped and echoed. 20 yards from the station door, I risked a glance over my shoulder. At the edge of the forest stood a figure partially obscured by trees. It appeared human-sized but oddly proportioned, its features indistinct at that distance. What I could see clearly was the motion of its body, its chest expanding unnaturally, its head tilted back, jaw dislocated to an impossible width as it produced the whistling sound. It slammed through the station door, gasping for breath. Reed looked up from his console, immediately understanding what had happened. "It's escalating," he said grimly, "just like in '87. That night, the whistling surrounded the station, coming from all directions at once. We huddled in the central monitoring room, listening as it circled the building for hours, occasionally punctuated by scratching at the windows and doors. In the morning, we found messages carved into the exterior walls. Not words, but musical notes. Staff from the regional office arrived the next day to replace the damaged siding, working quickly and silently, never acknowledging what they were covering up. The whistling stopped after that night and didn't return for the remainder of my time at Crawford Ridge. The logbook remained in the supply closet, waiting for the next cluster of incidents or curious researcher who might be tempted to answer when the forest calls. Few rules at Crawford Ridge seemed as arbitrary as rule number 4. All animal carcasses found on station grounds must be reported immediately. Don't touch them and don't photograph them. The Olympic Peninsula hosts abundant wildlife: deer, elk, black bears, cougars, and countless smaller species. Finding dead animals in or around a remote facility isn't all that unusual. Standard procedure at most research stations would involve documenting the find, often with photographs to identify it, proper disposal to avoid attracting predators, and perhaps testing if disease was suspected. Crawford Ridge's prohibition against even photographing such discoveries seemed excessive, until I encountered my first carcass during my 4th year at the station. It was early spring and the forest was transitioning from winter to explosive growth. I was checking the rain gauges along the western perimeter when I spotted what looked like a small deer lying near the equipment shed. From a distance, it appeared to be sleeping, its tawny coat blending in with the newly emerged ferns. As I approached, I realized that it was indeed dead, though not in any way that made sense. The animal lay on its side, its body appearing intact and unmarked. No visible wounds and no signs of predation or scavenging, but its proportions were off. Its limbs were too long, its neck extended beyond natural limits, and its skull malformed. I was reaching for my phone to document it when I remembered the rule. Instead, I radioed the station. Found a deer carcass near the western equipment shed. I reported. "Remain in visual contact but maintain distance." Reed responded immediately. "Ellis is on her way." Ellis arrived about 10 minutes later carrying a specialized kit that I had never seen before. Without acknowledging me, she approached the carcass and began a methodical examination. She took samples of fur, tissue, and what appeared to be fluid from around the animal's eyes and mouth. She measured the body with precise and practiced movements, recording each measurement in a small notebook. "What kind of deer is that?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. It doesn't look normal. Alice glanced up, seeming to notice me for the first time. It's not a deer. Well, then what is it? Rule 4 exists because what looks dead isn't always what it appears to be, she interrupted. This isn't the first such specimen that we've found, and it won't be the last. She continued her examination, finally removing a small metal device from her kit. It resembled a thermometer, but with multiple sensors extending from its tip. She inserted it into what I had assumed was the deer's ear. The animal's body convulsed suddenly, its limbs extending and contorting. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to retreat. Alice remained perfectly still, watching as the creature's form seemed to ripple and shift before finally collapsing into itself like a deflated balloon. Where the deer-like body had been, only a small pile of gray matter remained, something between ash and fabric, glistening slightly in the morning light. What was that? Alice collected a sample of the residue into a sealed container. We call them the Watchers. They're not animals, though they attempt to mimic the local wildlife, and they don't do it very well. Yeah, mimicry implies intelligence, I said, my scientific mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. Some kind of undocumented species. Oh, they're documented, Alice corrected me. Just not in any zoological journal that you've read. The Watchers appear approximately every 18 months in a cycle that we've tracked since the 1960s. They start with smaller animals, squirrels, rabbits, before attempting larger ones. Their mimicry improves with each attempt, she explained, packing away her equipment. The early specimens are clearly malformed like this one. By the end of the cycle, they become nearly indistinguishable from the genuine article, except for one consistent flaw, which is... Alice closed her kit. They get the eyes wrong. Too many irises usually, or pupils that change shape when they shouldn't. She stood, lifting the container with the residue. If you encounter one that looks perfect, check the eyes, and then run. What are they doing? I asked. Well, as their name implies, they're watching. Looking for physical structures, ways of being. She looked at me directly. The Watchers study before they replace. That's why we never touch them, never photograph them. Interaction appears to accelerate their learning process. But over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to the wildlife around the station, studying their movements and watching their eyes. 3 months after the first discovery, I spotted a cougar at the forest's edge during my morning perimeter check. For a moment, I admired its beauty, and then it turned its head toward me and I saw its eyes, triple irised, with pupils that shifted from round to rectangular as I watched. The creature held my gaze for one terrible moment before slipping back into the forest. I reported the sighting to Alice, who immediately ordered a lockdown of the station. For 3 days, we remained inside while specialized teams from the regional office searched the surrounding forest. They never did find the cougar or whatever had been wearing its shape. 2 weeks later, our maintenance technician failed to return from a routine repair job at the backup generator. We found his clothes and equipment neatly arranged beside the generator, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked away. Inside his shirt was a small pile of the same gray residue that I had seen when the deer creature had collapsed. His replacement arrived the following day, a man with the same build, same expertise, and same personality. But sometimes when the light hits him at certain angles, I can swear that his eyes just don't look right. Working at a remote weather station where communication with the outside world is limited, the satellite phone represents a critical link to the outside world. At Crawford Ridge, that link came with a specific warning. If the phone rings exactly twice, stops and then rings again, don't answer it. Disconnect the line for exactly 30 minutes and then reconnect it. For nearly 5 years, Rule 5 remained theoretical for me. The satellite phone rang occasionally, updates from the regional office, calls from family members of staff during designated communication windows, the rare emergency call during severe weather, but never in the pattern described in the rule. Until the night in late October when the distinctive cadence jolted me from falling asleep at the job at 2:17 a.m. I was on the night shift that week alone in the monitoring room when the sequence began. Despite years of conditioning, my first instinct was to answer. A lifetime of social programming that equates ringing phones with obligations to respond. My hand was reaching for the receiver when Reed's voice came from the doorway. "Hey, don't touch it." I hadn't heard him approach. He stood in his pajamas, hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were alert and hard. Reed crossed to the communications panel and disconnected the line without comment. The ringing cut off mid-tone. 30 minutes and then reconnect. Who would be calling at this hour anyway? I asked. Reed considered me for a moment before answering. "It's not who's calling that matters, it's when they're calling from." "I don't understand." "Crawford Ridge monitors more than just the weather. You've figured that out by now." "Like the Dawnwalker," I said, "and the Whistler and the Watchers." Reed nodded. "Yes, those are the physical manifestations, things that exist in our current time frame. But there's more than just that." I struggled to understand what he was suggesting. The phone calls are coming from a different time. Sometimes from the past, sometimes from the future that may or may not happen. Reed's face was grim in the dim emergency lighting. The pattern, 2 rings, a pause, and continuous ringing. That's a temporal displacement signature. The satellite system picks it up as a standard call, but it's not. It's a bleed-through. From when? Reed checked his watch. "We'll know in about 28 minutes. We sat in silence as the minutes ticked by. At exactly 2:47, Reed reconnected the line. Almost immediately, the phone began to ring again, but it was normal, continuous rings with no unusual pattern. "Now we can answer it," Reed said, nodding toward the phone. I lifted the receiver cautiously. "Crawford Ridge Weather Station." Static filled the line, punctuated by what sounded like fragments of voices speaking too quickly or too slowly to understand. And then abruptly, the connection clarified. Matt, is that you?" The voice was female, unfamiliar but somehow desperate. "Oh, thank God, listen carefully. On February 13th, 2026, do not..." The line dissolved into static again before cutting off completely. I stared at the now silent phone. February 13th, 2026. That's more than a year from now. "Probably," Reed agreed. Though temporal displacement isn't always linear, the call could be from an alternate timeline, or a potential future that may never come to be. But why call? What was she trying to warn me about? Reed's expression was unreadable. Knowing your future changes your choices, which changes the future, which retroactively changes the warning. It's an endless loop. So we're supposed to ignore these calls. What if it was important? What if someone is trying to prevent something terrible from happening? Well, the 30-minute disconnect breaks that circuit, Reed explained. It prevents stable communication channels from forming. When we reconnect, we get echoes, fragments that can't alter the timeline. Has anybody ever answered one of the original calls without the disconnect? Reed looked away. Once in 78. The station chief at the time, a man named Grayson, received a call in the pattern. He answered it directly. What happened? Well, according to the records, he had a 17-minute conversation with himself, an older version from 2003, warning about some catastrophic event. Grayson implemented immediate changes to station rules based on that call. The next morning, they found him in the forest. He had aged approximately 25 years overnight. His body was covered in burns consistent with intense radiation exposure, and his journal contained descriptions of events that wouldn't happen for decades. What he was saying was staggering. The call created some sort of time loop that actually physically affected him. The human mind isn't designed for any of this stuff. Reality breaks down at the point of paradox. In this case, Grayson himself became the paradox. I thought about the voice on the phone, the warning about February 13th. What if the call I just received was trying to prevent another Grayson situation? That's the problem with this information. You never know whether acting on it causes the very thing you're trying to prevent. The phone never rang like that again during my time at Crawford Ridge, but I marked February 13th, 2026 in my personal calendar, adding a simple note. Do not. Do not what? I still don't know. Perhaps I never will, and that's for the best. Monitoring the weather requires constant vigilance. Ignoring sensor alerts contradicts every protocol in weather research. Yet Crawford Ridge's rules demanded exactly that. 6 hours of deliberate blindness to whatever might trigger our northern perimeter sensors during the darkest hours of the night. For 6 years, I complied without incident. The sensors would occasionally trigger, perhaps once every few months, and following protocol, I would ignore the alerts, resist checking the cameras, and reset the system at the designated time. I never knew what caused those alerts, and after my experiences with the other rules, I had learned not to ask about it. Until one night, a major storm system was approaching from the north, potentially the most severe weather event since I had joined the station. The barometric pressure dropped rapidly throughout the day. Wind speeds were increasing, and our radar showed a massive precipitation front moving directly toward us. I was on overnight monitoring duty with our newest staff member, a meteorologist named Val, who had replaced Reed after his retirement 3 months earlier. Val was brilliant but skeptical of these station's rules, someplace that I had been before. At 11:47, just 13 minutes before Rule 6 went into effect, Alice called an emergency briefing. "This system is behaving abnormally," she informed us, displaying the radar imagery. "The rotation patterns suggest potential for tornado development, despite conditions that shouldn't support such formations in this region. Yeah, the mountains would typically disrupt the necessary wind shear," Val observed, "unless there's another factor that we're not accounting for." Alice's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll maintain standard monitoring protocols," she said, carefully avoiding any mention of the rules in front of our new colleague. "Winters, you'll handle the southern quadrant. Val, focus on precipitation measurements and wind patterns." "But what about the northern approach?" Val asked. "That's where the system's coming from. Shouldn't we focus on that?" "I'll be overseeing the northern section personally," Alice replied. The storm hit with full force just after midnight. Wind gusts were over 90 miles per hour and rain lashed horizontally against the station's walls. The building itself seemed to groan under the onslaught. We worked frantically, documenting readings, tracking the system's evolution, and relaying data to emergency services in the surrounding counties. At 1:17 a.m., the northern perimeter sensors triggered. Alerts flashed across our monitoring system, accompanied by a piercing alarm that was able to cut through the storm. Alice immediately silenced it. "Automatic trigger for debris impact," she announced calmly. "We'll reset it at the standard time." Val looked confused. "Shouldn't we be checking the camera feeds? If the perimeter's compromised?" "It's not," Alice interrupted. "A standard false positive during severe weather. Continue monitoring your assigned quadrant. For the next hour, we worked in tense silence, the storm intensifying around us. The northern sensors triggered twice more, and each time, Ellis dismissed the alerts without checking the cameras. At 2:34, everything changed though. A massive lightning strike hit somewhere extremely close to the station. So close that you could hear the thunder at the same time as the flash, the concussion rattling the equipment on the shelves. The lights flickered, stabilized, and then went out completely as our main power failed. Luckily this time, the emergency generator kicked on in seconds, restoring everything, but the sudden power cycle had reset our security protocols. All the camera feeds automatically displayed on the main monitoring screen, including the northern perimeter cameras that should have remained unchecked until 6:01 a.m. What we saw froze us all in place. The northern forest line, which should have been barely visible in the storm, was illuminated by dozens of pale vertical lights, slender pillars of luminescence that swayed slightly in the wind. They followed the property boundary, each one approximately 10 feet tall and no wider than a human arm. "What are those?" Val whispered, moving closer to the screen. Alice lunged for the display controls. "Just a malfunction, ignore it." But before she could deactivate the feed, one of the light pillars moved, not swaying with the wind but deliberately stepping forward and crossing our perimeter line. The others followed behind, advancing toward the station with smooth, flowing movements. "Those aren't equipment malfunctions. Those are..." "We don't know what they are," Alice snapped, finally managing to cut the feed. "And Rule 6 exists to keep it that way." But it was too late. We had seen them, and somehow they had sensed our observation. The building shuddered as something struck the north wall. Not the impact of storm debris, but a deliberate testing blow. And then another and another. "What do they want?" Keeping my voice low as if they might hear us. Alice was already moving toward a storage cabinet that I had never seen her open before. "Well, they want in," she said grimly, removing what looked like to be some kind of strange scientific device. "They always want in." "What are we dealing with, Chief?" Val demanded. Alice hesitated and then made a decision. "The northern forest contains what we categorize as observer entities. They're drawn to human consciousness, specifically to the act of scientific observation. Like quantum particles that change when they're observed," I suggested. "Well, the reverse," Alice corrected, distributing these strange devices. "They change when they're doing the observing. They feed on the process of data collection itself. They've been trying to access the station since it was established in 1952. Alice continued activating her device, which emitted a soft and pulsing glow. "Rule 6 exists because they can only locate us through active observation. If we don't check the cameras when these sensors trigger, they can't establish a connection." "But we saw them." "Yes, and now they've seen us seeing them. The connection is active." Alice handed each of us what looked like modified welding goggles. "Put these on. Whatever happens, do not look directly at them without protection." The northern door buckled suddenly. "What do we do?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Well, we wait," Alice said, checking her watch. "We have 4 hours and 17 minutes until 6:01. If we can hold them off until then, their window closes and they'll retreat." The door bulged inward further, a seam along its edge beginning to split. "And if we can't?" Alice's expression was empty of everything except resignation. "Well, then Crawford Ridge gets a new staff and new rules are written from whatever we learn tonight." The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. The entities, the pale light pillars, breached our outer doors but were somehow slowed by Alice's devices, which created some type of barrier that seemed to confuse and disorient them. We retreated to the central monitoring room, sealing emergency bulkheads to buy some time. Through the internal cameras, we watched as they moved throughout our station with terrible purpose, looking at our equipment, our personal quarters, our research. They left no physical evidence of their passage. Objects that they touched remain unchanged. Doors they passed through showed no damage. Only the security cameras revealed their presence. They made it to the final bulkhead at 5:47 a.m. 14 minutes, Ellis murmured. We just need 14 minutes. The metal of the bulkhead began to ripple as if becoming temporarily liquid. A slender tendril of light pushed through, curling into the room like a searching finger. Don't look, Ellis warned as Val started to remove her protective goggles. That's what they want. Once they establish a direct optical contact, they can extract everything, not just what you know but how you know it. The tendril extended further, sweeping the room in a deliberate pattern. More followed until 5 separate probes of light were exploring the monitoring center. One passed directly through my chest, causing no physical sensation but leaving me with a profound feeling of having been examined at a level deeper than anatomy. At 5:58 a.m., they found what they had been searching for: Ellis's machine in the northeast corner. The tendrils converged on it, coiling around its components with something that resembled eagerness. No, Ellis whispered, lurching forward. Chief, don't do it. I caught her arm, holding her back. No, they can't have it. Do you understand what will happen if they learn how to operate it? The world as we know it will be in danger. They'll have access to everything. The machine began to glow as the light entities interfaced with it. The glass tubes bubbling with sudden activity, the recording drums spinning at impossible speeds. On the connected computer, data flowed too quickly to read. 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and then 1. At precisely 6:01 a.m., Ellis broke free of my restraint and lunged for the reset panel on the far wall. As her hand came down on the button, the light entities convulsed together, their slender forms contracting and then expanding in what looked like a final download of information. Then they withdrew, retreating through the walls and barriers and disappearing in the direction that they had come from. Silence fell. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Alice stood motionless before her machine, examining it for signs of tampering or damage. What did they take? I finally asked. Well, information, but more importantly, methodology. They've learned how we monitor them, which means that our current methods will soon become obsolete. So we have to adapt, Val said, removing her goggles now that the danger had passed. We must develop new monitoring techniques. Ellis's laugh held no humor. We've been adapting since '52. Every time we develop new methods, they eventually learn them and incorporate them. They evolve beyond them. It's an arms race where our opponent assimilates our weapons. She turned to face us, her expression harder than I had ever seen it. Rule number 6 has been compromised. We need a new rule. That morning, Ellis issued a new laminated card. Rule 6 now read, if the northern perimeter sensors trigger between midnight and 6 a.m., evacuate all personnel to the underground shelter. Initiate complete station shutdown. Do not emerge until 8:17 a.m., regardless of external communications. I never learned what the light entities truly were. Could they be scientists from another dimension, simply searching and trying to learn more? What I do know is that the northern perimeter never triggered again during night hours for the remainder of my time at Crawford Ridge. But sometimes during daylight shifts, I would catch a glimpse of something like heat shimmer at the forest's edge. Distortions that might have been light playing through the trees, or might have been the observers watching us, learning from us and waiting for their next opportunity. So yes, my job working at a remote weather station has been everything but boring and tedious. Strange things happen here, and it's my responsibility to adapt and stay ahead of the terrors out there in the world. For as long as I'm here, I'll do my best to keep you all safe, and I don't think I'll be leaving anytime soon.
Richard French, Miss Eldridge, Jimmy Griffin, Shelley